Look at a map of the United States and you'll notice something strange. In the east, counties twist and bend like spilled ink, winding around rivers, mountains, and centuries of history. But in the west, it's different. The map suddenly transforms into clean geometry, perfect squares and rectangles, some so vast they're larger than the entire states back east. Why? This isn't random. These borders hide a forgotten history about power, land, and control. About an 18th century experiment to impose mathematics on wilderness, to carve up a continent before anyone had ever seen it. It shaped migration, politics, and identity. These lines may look simple, but they hold one of the most audacious experiments in history, an attempt to draw order onto chaos. Zoom out onto a U.S. map, and the contrast is impossible to miss. In the Northeast, counties are tiny, twisting, and chaotic. Some are barely bigger than a few city blocks. Worcester County, Massachusetts fits into just 1,500 square miles, but has nearly 1 million people. Head down to Maryland, and you'll find Kent County, only 280 square miles total, yet home to communities that have existed since the 1600s. And counties here don't just look small, they feel lived in. Boundaries follow rivers that once powered mills, ridges that separated colonial farms, or wagon trails that hardened onto county lines. In Pennsylvania, you can trace the shape of counties to the valleys where early Germans and Quakers settled. In Virginia, county lines often align with the boundaries of colonial plantations, drawn long before the Revolution. Cross into Vermont, and counties barely reach 1,000 square miles, yet many have courthouses dating back to the 1700s. Each one feels like a pocket of identity. Franklin County, home of dairy farmers. Rutland County, with its marble quarries. These borders came from centuries of community ties, not from rulers with compasses. Now look westward. In Texas, East Texas counties still hug rivers and forests, with irregular shapes like their eastern cousins. But by the time you reach the Panhandle, suddenly the map is nothing but rectangles. The shift is abrupt. And in Nevada, counties stretch across entire deserts. Nye County alone is more than 18,000 square miles, bigger than Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey combined. Yet it holds barely 50,000 people. The extremes are staggering. In Montana, Beaverhead County is larger than Slovenia. Meanwhile, Arlington County, Virginia crams more people into just 26 square miles than Beaverhead has across its entire landscape of mountains, rivers, and plains. And here's the kicker. This isn't just a cartographic curiosity. These shapes determined where railroads were built, how settlers spread, how governments functioned, even who held political power. Counties weren't just lines. They were systems of order imposed on a continent. The answer to this bizarre split lies in one of the most ambitious land experiments ever attempted, a decision made in the 1780s that still governs America's shape, identity, and power today. Maps like this tell more than history. They reveal how power reshapes the world in silence. And if you're into stories like this, where a single line on a map changes millions of lives, you're in the right place. This is Borderline History. And if you want to see where the next map takes us, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps these stories reach more curious minds around the world. The year is 1785. The Revolutionary War is over. The United States is free, but almost broke. The government has massive war debts, no income tax, and barely functioning infrastructure. What it does have is land, endless stretches ceded by Britain after independence. But land ownership back then wasn't simple. How do you claim, sell, and govern thousands of square miles of wilderness, rivers, and mountains? Without a system, chaos was inevitable. So Congress passed the Land Ordinance in 1785, a law that would silently shape America's entire geography. Its goal? turn untamed land into wealth by creating an orderly, universal system to measure, divide, and sell property. This gave birth to the Public Land Survey System, the PLSS, one of the largest mapping projects in history. The entire western frontier was carved into perfect townships, each exactly 6 miles by 6 miles, divided further into 36 sections, each 640 acres. Surveyors laid down a system of principal meridians and baselines, invisible axes stretching across states. For the first time, settlers could buy land before even stepping foot on it, knowing exactly what they were getting. A farmer in Illinois could buy 160 acres and compare it to a parcel in Kansas, and both would be perfectly measured, perfectly square. The grid ignored rivers, forests, mountains, and existing cultural boundaries. It reduced the wilderness to mathematics, an invisible lattice of power stretching across half a continent. And it wasn't just geometry, it was philosophy. Thomas Jefferson himself had dreamed of dividing America into neat, orderly squares. In his vision, a nation of independent farmers, yeoman farmers, would each own a perfect plot, equally sized, equally measured. Land, Jefferson believed, was the foundation of democracy. But this mathematical conquest came at a cost. Millions of acres of indigenous land were surveyed, sold, and occupied without consultation. Entire nations were displaced as rectangular parcels cut across ancestral hunting grounds, sacred sites, and natural borders. Still, the PLSS worked. It created uniform property rights, drove westward migration, and allowed the U.S. government to transform land into revenue at unprecedented speed. By the mid-1880s, this invisible grid covered nearly everything west of the Mississippi. Two Americas were born, an organic East shaped by centuries of geography, and an engineered West built on straight lines, chains, and compasses. Surveying the frontier wasn't glamorous. Surveyors hauled 66-foot-long iron chains through forests, deserts, and mountain passes, measuring 1 mile at a time. Each township corner was marked with wooden posts, cairns, or etched stones. Errors were common and permanent. In Colorado, the PLSS grid stretches almost flawlessly for hundreds of miles, perfectly visible from the sky. But in California, rivers and fault lines warped the grid, creating awkward wedges and mismatched borders. Counties like San Luis Obispo still carried jagged lines born from early surveying mistakes. Sometimes the grid was drawn before anyone even saw the land. Paper counties existed decades before real settlers arrived, which meant county lines often ignored rivers, valleys, and entire mountain ranges. Today, you can still find county boundaries slicing straight through lakes or cutting across impassable ridges simply because Congress guessed wrong on a map 200 years ago. Some mistakes became iconic. The Colorado-Wyoming border was supposed to follow the 41st parallel, but early surveyors missed by a few lines. Nebraska's border with South Dakota also has a famous jog, a crooked line caused by surveying confusion along the Missouri River. And the checkerboard didn't just exist on maps. When the federal government granted alternating square-mile sections of land to railroads to encourage westward expansion, the result was checkerboard land ownership patterns still visible today in states like Wyoming and Utah. Fly over these areas and you'll literally see alternating green and brown squares from above, private versus public, determined by a deal struck in Washington in the 1800s. This rectangular takeover created one of the cleanest-looking maps on Earth, but it came with a problem no one predicted: population. The PLSS assumed settlers would spread evenly across all surveyed land, but the western frontier wasn't like the Fertile East. Much of it was desert, mountain, or prairie, too dry for farming. As a result, counties ballooned in size to encompass enough taxable land, even if barely anyone lived there. Take Coconino County, Arizona, nearly 18,000 square miles, bigger than 9 U.S. states, but fewer than 150,000 residents. Compare that to Cook County, Illinois, home to Chicago, just 1,600 square miles, but over 5 million people. The result is a political and cultural divide literally drawn into the map. Where you live, in a tiny East Coast county or a sprawling Wyoming rectangle, still dictates your experience of government, identity, and daily life. And yet, despite these inefficiencies, the system hasn't changed in more than 200 years. Why? Because undoing it would mean rewriting millions of property deeds, tax codes, and legal frameworks tied to these shapes. But what if we could start over? Imagine erasing every county boundary and redesigning America's map from scratch, using modern tools, satellites, population data, and economic modeling, instead of 18th century chains and compasses. Counties could follow real communities instead of arbitrary squares. Los Angeles County, with 10 million people, might be split into smaller, smarter regions with dedicated infrastructure and localized governance. We could draw boundaries based on population density to balance representation, economic zones tied to jobs and commuting patterns, climate resilience, creating regions better equipped to manage floods, fires, and droughts, shared infrastructure, grouping towns by the resources they actually depend on. Globally, other countries have done this. Japan restructured its prefectures to match modern realities. The UK has repeatedly redrawn administrative boundaries to better match population clusters and transit systems. Canada reorganized its Northwest territories multiple times as population shifted. But in the US, changing a single county line can take decades of lawsuits, legislation, and public votes. The system is so entrenched that redesigning it is almost unthinkable. And yet, it's fascinating to imagine. A country where maps reflect how people actually live, work, and connect, instead of a 230-year-old grid frozen in time. Those giant squares out west aren't random. They're a living artifact, the visible remains of an audacious 18th century experiment to engineer a continent. A decision made in 1785 still defines how Americans live, vote, govern, and even see themselves. Every map hides a story. This one hides America's experiment in geometry, a plan so ambitious it reshaped the land forever, for better and worse. Now I want to hear from you. If we could redesign America's counties today from scratch, would you keep the giant western squares or erase the grid entirely? Comment down below. I'll be reading and joining the conversation. And also, tell me what other map mysteries you'd like me to cover in future videos. I'm building this channel from the ground up after 8 years of editing for others, and now I'm finally chasing my own dream of creating these deep dive map documentaries. So if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to Borderline History. It may seem small, but it truly helps me grow this channel and keep making content like this. Because the more you look at a map, the more you realize the lines aren't just borders, they're history, and they're shaping your life right now.